The following program is a videotape production of the Maine Public Broadcasting Network.
Joe Perham came over the other night from West Paris. He was telling me about this fellow that kept warm all last winter with one stick of wood. Kept throwing it out through the window and then going after it. I guess Joe ain't the only character in West Paris.
Have you ever been to West Paris?
I've been through there. I never stopped.
Well, you might have gone through there and not even realized it. It's not the biggest town in the state of Maine, but we made the papers this last winter. I don't think 2 weeks went by but the town of West Paris is in the newspapers up here in Maine, all the way down New England. You see, we make clothespins in West Paris.
Mm-hmm.
You probably heard the Penley's clothespin mill.
Yeah, you've been having trouble with tariff problems.
Tariff problems, you're right. You know, they're making these cheap clothespins over in Romania,
Yeah.
Red China, and having all kinds of problems, one kind or another. Well, as it works out, Washington got in on it. You know, Albert Penley's been running that mill by himself for 40 years, but the last few years the government's been helping him out a lot, or they think they've been helping him out. Well, they sent 4 congressmen up, looked the situation over. They looked the mill over, you know, and they looked the wood over, one thing or another, and there was this one guy from Texas. I don't know what name that man is, some congressman from Texas. He started criticizing the way they were doing things there in West Paris. He says, you know, if this mill down in Texas, we'd be putting out 5 times the clothespins you put up here, and it'd probably only take two times the number of people. He says, you take your storage inventory building off to one side. He says, you can't build up enough stock to compete on the open market with a little place like that. He says, you know, we got outhouses down Texas bigger than that. And, oh, well, but he looked at Congressman Coldstone in the eye and he says, I guess you probably need them.
Well, you know, there was a fellow from Maine was visiting down in Texas. What he was doing down there, I don't know, but he was there. And he was looking all around. Of course, the country down there is a lot different. They get strange things down there, strange to him.
Never been in it.
Well, he was looking around and he see this funny-looking bird. And he says to the Texan that owned that property, he says, what kind of a bird is that? And the Texan, he swelled all up, you know. He says, that is a bird of paradise. And the old fellow from Maine says, he's a long ways from home, ain't he?
Yeah, he's a long way from home, is right. You know, that clothespin mill there, about 3 months ago, they sent a group of people up from Augusta to run a labor survey, and they asked Albert, how many employees you got working at any time? Well, Albert says about half of them. So they asked him, how many employees you got approaching retirement age? Well, Albert says, I don't know if we got any going the other way. Interesting little town. You ever get there, stop by on Route 26, that little trap corner store.
Yeah.
And you'll find just about any type of person you want to find there. I don't know if you realize it, but Trap Corner is just half away between Quebec City and Boston, Massachusetts, almost in the quarter of a mile.
No, it didn't.
No, we have a lot of out-of-staters, you know. We have a lot of city visitors come in there, and they'll go in, you know, they'll order a cup of coffee, and they'll sit there drinking the coffee, and then they'll start to ask foolish questions. You know, I asked Dickie Baker, you got any nightlife in a little town like this? And Dickie says, no, she just moved down to Welchville.
They never learn, do they?
No, they don't. I asked Ed Cooley, you lived here all your life? Ed says, God, not yet. Ed, he's kind of a typical Maine character, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
60 years old, and he'd been through most of it. And they tell about this one time, I wasn't there, but they tell about this one time he was sitting up to the counter there, you know, having a cup of coffee. Now, he shouldn't drink an awful lot of coffee because he has this gas problem.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this little problem with his lower bowel tract sort of builds up on him. Well, he was sitting there, you know, and he commenced to look a little uncomfortable. Now, what he ought to have done, he's ought to go out to the little place out back the store. But he didn't, you know. He thought maybe he could sneak something out, but, well, he broke wind. That's what he did. Of course, the people there at Trap Corner, they didn't even pay any attention to it because they're used to that kind of thing. But, you know, there was an old fella sitting over there at the left, eating dinner with his wife. He pushed his chair back, you know, something like this, you know. He got up on his feet, and he come over and he put his fist under Ed's nose, and he says, "How dare you," he says, "do that before my wife?" Well, Ed, he kind of looks around. He says, I'm so sorry, he said. I didn't know it was her turn. And he didn't, you know. He's kind of a polite sort of a fella. He doesn't like to take advantage of a city visitor, you know, that way. He'd been to the city himself. I don't know whether politics is a proper topic for conversation, but you know, our Honorable Ed Muskie come into my hometown here about 12 months ago. He made a comment that should go down history. You see, of course, he's a Democratic senator, and a lot of the folks in West Paris aren't Democrats.
Yeah.
When he come into town there, he looked all around for a podium, you know, so he could get up above people, you know, talk to him. He's a tall man, but he's looking for something to stand up on. He happens to see Ole Olson's manure spreader over on Bert Lang's lawn. So he goes over there, you know, and he climbs up on that manure spreader, and he says, "You know, this is the first time I've ever delivered a speech from the Republican platform." It's the way he put it. Well, there's a fella up on High Street, you know, that didn't like that remark at all. So he come right over, you know, and he stood right in front of Ed Muskie. When he started his question and answer period, the first question this man asked, he says, "You're not a congressman, are you?" Ed says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Of course I'm a congressman. I'm Ed Muskie." Well, the old fella says, "It's hard for me to believe." Ed says, "Why?" Well, he says, "Look," he says, "you got your hands in your own pockets." Was the way he put it. Yeah.
Well, you know, it's like you say. Years ago, though, it was even more so that small towns in Maine was almost 100% Republican. And they had an election in one of these towns, and I won't name it, but it was a small Maine town. They had this election. And the way they counted the ballots was they counted them by hand. And this was in the days when you could vote a straight ticket. Just by making an X at the top of the page, you'd vote a straight Democrat or a straight Republican ticket. And the voting was all done, and they was counting the ballots. And the clerk was there, and a bunch of other people that worked for the town. And the head selectman was there. And they was counting these, and the head selectman had a whole pile of them there, and he was peeling them off like this and piling them up. And he was saying, "Republican, Republican, 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 Democrat." And he looked all around. Nobody said anything. He put that one Democrat ballot over here, away from the rest. He kept on going. Republican, 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 Democrat. He looked at the clerk and he says, "That son of a bitch must have voted twice."
Yeah. Well, I don't know what that could have been, the town we've been talking about.
Could have been.
I'm not even going to mention the name of the one Democrat either. Because he passed away here 2 or 3 years ago. Speaking of that, we had a fellow who been married to this woman for a number of years, and she finally died. Well, problem was he had 9 kids, you see. And he had to work every day, and he couldn't take care of them himself, so what he did was he got married the following day. That's fact. Got married the following day, you know, so those kids could have a mother, and so he could have somebody to put up his lunch. Well, that night of the wedding, you know, a bunch of friends got together. They thought they'd give him a real frou-frou, you know, chivalry, like they call it out west, and they had a lot of spirits, you know, under their belts, you know, and they had their guns with them. They were firing off, you know, it was just like a smelting party. Well, the old fella, you know, had to get up the next day. So he come to the door, you know. He finally got the attention, everybody out there, and he says, "What's the matter with you folks?" He says, "Ain't you got no respect for the dead?" was the way he put it.
Well, you mentioned liquor. You ever hear about that fellow from Newfoundland that came down to Boston there to work? He was there quite a little while. He worked on construction, and he worked hard. Every Friday when he got paid, he'd save out just enough for a pint of whiskey. He'd send the rest back home to Canada. Well, he wasn't too swift. So this one Friday, him and his buddy came out of the liquor store down there, and he had that pint bottle in his back pocket, like that.
Yep.
And it was in the wintertime. He come out that door, took 2 steps, and his feet went out from under him, and down he went, like that. Well, he stood up. And he'd already sent the rest of the money home. He stood up, and he looked this other fellow right in the eye, and he could feel something running down his leg. He reached back like that, and he said, "Oh, I hope that's blood."
I wish you hadn't reached around for that hip pocket. That reminds me of a story they tell about Doc Wheeler. You know, he always rode this horse. I told you about the horse a little earlier. You know, he always had it under him. Well, they tell about this one time he was going up over Church Hill. He had some business downtown, and that horse stopped on him. Well, he'd had the horse, you know, for a number of years, never had any trouble with it. So he got out and he says, "Come on, Sarah." He says, "Come on now." But that horse wouldn't move. Well, he went into the buggy, you know, and got the horse whip, and he started belaraping the beast a little bit, but she still wouldn't move. He didn't know what he was going to do. He was just about ready, you know, to give the whole thing up when who should come walking up the hill, you know, but Foster's oldest boy, Junior. Well, Junior come alongside with the remark, "Doc," he says, you're having horse trouble, ain't you?" Well, Doc says, "Yes, I am." He says, "I've been thumping around on this beast for much 15 minutes. He says, "I guess it's kind of froze on me." Well, the boy says, I got something in my hip pocket that'll start that horse." Well, he reaches around, you know, and he pulls out this bottle, and he says, "Doc," he says, "this is a bottle of turpentine." He says, "You get around to the back of that horse," he says, "and lift his tail up, and I'll put a couple of drops where I think it'll do the most good." Well, they say Doc did, you know, and the boy did, and they say that horse's old head ended up lit out of there, and by God, for you couldn't see the horse nor the buggy for the dust. Well, they say old Doc watched that horse, you see, disappear off into dim vista. He looked at the boy and he says, "Junior," he says, "I don't know when I see a better job of horse starting." He says, "There's only one thing that bothers me." He says, "I was kind of hoping to get to the village myself." He says, "And that ain't all." He says, "I got to catch that horse." He says, I don't suppose you'd have 1 or 2 more drops of that stuff, would you?" These town doctors, they don't get the recognition that's due them. This Doc Wheeler, for example, he was sort of a saintly man in his own way, you know. He was doctor in that community for over 40 years. He widowered rather young, and until about this one time that he went into church over there at North Paris. And as was his custom, he took this big top hat that he always wore and set it in the pew beside him. Well, most of the unattached ladies you see in the area, they'd set their sights on Doc Wheeler the minute his wife died. And So they kind of looked out for him, cooked for him, you know, gave him pies, one thing or another. Well, there's one time I'm telling you about, the freebie woman came in. She saw him sitting all by himself down there in that pew, you know, so she came in, she snuggled in the pew beside him, and not an awful lot of light in these churches, and she sat right down on that hat. And what she did that hat, they still talk about today. Well, of course, she felt it. She got up, and she looked at Doc Wheeler, kind of sheepish-like, and he looked at her, and he said, Fanny, her name was Fanny. He says, Fanny, he says, I could have told you it wouldn't have fitted. You know, he is responsible, you know, for keeping a lot of people alive that probably wouldn't have made it otherwise.
Yeah?
Yeah. We got a fella in town that was a patient of his. He's 107 years old. It's hard to believe.
107.
Yeah. He's had the gold cane in that town now for much 19 years. The I.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company found out that he'd been smoking Camel cigarettes, you know, ever since they hit the market. I don't know if you know this, Kendall, but Camel cigarettes came off the market way back 1913 in the month of February.
Mm-hmm.
Well, when that tobacco company found out there's a man up in Maine been smoking Camel cigarettes ever since they hit the market, and this was just last year, 78, they sent a Madison Avenue executive up. You know, kind of hire him to do a few ads for them. They came to the house at Trap Conan. Man's granddaughter let him in. The old fellow's over sitting on the sofa, you know, he's about spry as any man that age could be. And that executive said, sir, he says, I will give you $5,000 to come down to New York City and appear on the Today Show. He says, we'll put you up in the best hotels. He says, we'll buy you the best food. He says, we'll give you any kind of entertainment you can stand. He says, all you have to do, he says, is get up at 8 o'clock in the morning and appear on the Today Show and tell 40 million American viewers you've been smoking Camel cigarettes ever since they hit the market. Well, the old guy says, I don't think I can do that. Well, the guy says, why not? He said, I'm talking about $5,000. Well, hell, the old guy says, I don't stop coughing till noon.
You want your coffee heated up?
Well, I think we could stand a little. She's not really that bad. You make a pretty good cup of coffee. Well, looks like this cup's going to be blacker than the last one.
Now, you know you got something. I don't like that kind that you can read a newspaper through a gallon of it.
Through a gallon of it? You know, speaking of smoking, you ever hear of old Uncle Solon Chase? He's a man lived in Chase's Mills over in Turner years and years ago. And he ran as candidate for the presidency of the United States under the greenback ticket.
Yeah?
Well, he lectured all the way up and down the coast, you know, from Portland down to Boston, down to Baltimore. And they tell about this one time, the WCTU ladies down in Baltimore asked him to speak on the evils of the tobacco habit. Well, Uncle Solon said, I know it's evil. He says, I know it from personal experience. He says, my great-grandmother, he says, was half-breed Indian. So he put it. He says she smoked incessantly. He says, I can remember her getting up in the middle of the night to smoke. She lived to be 102. He says, I always figured it was tobacco that killed her. You know, every town, Kendall, has its slow fella.
Oh, yeah.
I suspect a lot of towns have more than one.
Mm-hmm.
But usually they heap their humor upon a single individual. We got a fellow like that in town, but I sometimes wonder who the slow fella really is. You know, they say things about him like he's a few bricks shy of a lord.
Mm-hmm.
Or he's been in the fourth grade for 2 terms, and Hoovers and Roosevelts. You know, they tell about the time, and I guess this is true, about the time he bought this toupee, you know, and he slapped it on his head. It's a beautiful thing, a black thing, split right down the middle, you know, and fit just perfect. And he'd walking out through the cow pasture, and the wind blew it off. And they say he tried on 6 before he found the right one. Well, they're always telling stories like that about him, but usually he comes out ahead, if you know what I mean. They tell about this one time he went into blacksmith shop up on Greenwood Road, and Phil, the blacksmith, he didn't like to have him around, you know, because he was always picking things up, you know, and rearranging them, looking at them, one thing or another. Well, he thought he'd put this hot horseshoe on top of the horseshoe pile. He knew the guy'd get there sooner or later, and, well, he got there sooner, you know. Of course, it burned him a little bit, and he dropped that horseshoe on the floor, and Phil says, "What's the matter, burn you?" Well, the slow fella says, "Nope." He says, "It just don't take me long to look at a horseshoe." Now, you remember the Depression days back in '32, I guess it was, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was made President of the United States. He initiated this WPA, it's Works Progress Administration. I think it's something like the CETA operation that they have nowadays. And one thing they did was they sent a fella up to West Paris, and they hired a number of men who were otherwise unemployed and set them to work digging this big hole in the middle of town. Well, they didn't know what they were going to put in that hole. That wasn't the purpose. The purpose was to keep the men employed and occupied. Eventually, they put the West Paris Gymnasium in the hole. Well, they'd just finished this gigantic excavation when this slow fella come by. He looked at that big hole. He says, "What you digging that hole for?" Well, there's a fellow by the name of Beamish, you know. He was foreman of the operation. He thought he'd be smart. Well, he says, "We're going to take all the dumb fools in this town," he says, "and we're going to bury them in that hole. That's what we're digging it for." Well, poor Clayt, you know, he stepped back, and he looks at Beamish, and he looks at that hole. He looks at those men. He says, "Who are you going to get to cover him over?" I don't exactly know what he meant by that, but it seems to me he kind of come out ahead, you know. He seems to me that he kind of come out on top. You don't have to look very far, incidentally, for a Maine humorist. Doesn't make any difference where you are. I came home here a few nights ago, and I got home rather late, and I asked if my youngest boy had gone to bed. And, well, my wife says he just went up here a short while ago. Maybe he's still awake. So I went up, you know, to say goodnight to him. And I got up there he was, over on the other side of the bed, down on his knees. Now, I like to be a good example to my children, you know, so I got down on my knees and I started praying too. He looks across the bed, you know, and he says, what you doing, Daddy?" Well, I says, "I'm doing the same thing you are, son." Well, he says, "Mama's going to be awful mad." He says, "There's only one pot in here."
Kids, you can't beat them.
No, you can't.
The other day, I left my fiddle in my car, and when I thought of it, we were out somewhere else. I told my little girl, I said, "When we get home, you be sure and remind me to bring that fiddle in out of the car." Well, she's 7. Well, she remembers that fiddle. She said, "What's it doing in the car?" And I said, "Well, I took it out and had it repaired." And she thought a couple of seconds, and then she says, "Does it still squeak?"
Yeah. Yeah, you say you can't beat kids, but you know, you remember what the state legislature tried to do this last winter? They were going to...
Among other things, what?
Well, they were going to enact a law putting corporal punishment back into schools.
Really?
Sure. Well, they're talking about that up West Paris, and, you know, about how much better a kid could learn, you know, if a teacher could give him a licking. The consensus of opinion up there was that probably it'd be a good rule. Generally speaking, they figured that a kid would learn better, you know, if a teacher could lick him. Well, that was all well and good, except one of the Hadley boys didn't agree. He says there's no value in a licking. Says a licking never helped a kid learn. He said, I remember, he says, the worst licking I ever got was for telling the truth. Well, Ed Cooley says, you got to admit, it cured you. Yeah. These backward humorists are all around.
It pays to have a sense of humor and live in a climate such as we live in.
Yes, I believe you're right. You know, 150 years ago, some of the top humorists in the country were from this area right here.
Oh, yes.
I guess there was a fellow by the name of Seba Smith from Buckfield, and Bill Nye from Shirley Mill, and down Oxford County where I live, there was Artemus Ward.
Yeah.
He was the man who made Lincoln laugh. Lincoln would start his cabinet meetings reading from the essays of Artemus Ward. I remember reading one here just a short while ago. I think you'd get a kick out of it. Artemus Ward's talking about his wife. And he says, I never tried to reorganize my wife, only once. He says, I shall never attempt again. He said, you see, I'd been downtown to public dinner. I'd somehow allowed myself to be betrayed, he said, into drinking several people's healths. Wishing to make them as healthy as possible, I continued drinking their healths, you know, till my own become affected. Well, consequence was, he said, I presented myself at Betsy's bedside, Betsy's my wife, Betsy's bedside late that night with considerable liquor concealed about my person. Now, I'd somehow got possession of a horsewhip on my way home. And remembering some cranky observations of Mrs. Ward's in the morning, I snapped the whip pretty lively. You see, in a very loud voice, I said, Betsy, you need reorganizing. I have come, Betsy, I said, continuing to crack the whip over her bed. By George, I've come to reorganize you. Well, you know, I dreamt that night that someone had laid a horsewhip over me several consecutive times. And when I woke up, I found she had. Well, I'll tell you, I ain't drunk much of anything since. If I ever have another reorganizing job, he says, I shall let it out to bids.
Well, that reminds me of the time I called my wife Angel. She asked me why, and I said, because you're always up in the air harping about something. Come pretty close to getting reorganized myself with that one.